All right, welcome in. This is the first part of the Unit 2 video series as we get ready for the AP test here in the year 2020. But if you are listening to this in the future and can go outside and go into a crowd of people and can enjoy life to the fullest, most, if not all, of this content will still be relevant for you. So, again, what we're going to look at here in the first part is just the standards that relate mostly to population. We're going to save migration for another time. Doing population migration together in one video would be a little bit much. So my expectation for you and what I expect for you when using this tool is you can kind of let it go and let it play and listen to the whole thing in the time that's allowed, or you can take a look at what the standards are. And if you're skimming through it and you're like, you know what, DTM, I got that. I don't need to do 2.5. But you know what? I might want to look at population pyramids again, population composition. So skip around. This should flow pretty easily. And it's something that you can use up to your understanding of what you need to review from Unit 2. I have a good feeling that in this year, 2020, that this is going to be a very relevant content area for what the questions are going to be. There's going to be things that you can tie in at the very least from things in this video. So again, it's very important that you understand the demography or demographics, population studies aspect of AP human geography. So when we look at the big ideas that this unit covers, this slide is really a technical slide. It gives us kind of as it says, the big ideas, right? So you're going to obviously have to get a little bit more in depth than what you see here, but just to get us thinking, the first big idea is wrapping itself around the question, how does where and how people live impact our global cultural, political, and economic patterns? So the fact that people live where they do, and the amount of people that live in those certain places, how does that impact the way we live our lives, both culturally, politically, and also economically? Where are the links in the connective tissue that we can find in those questions? Big idea too, how does the interplay of environmental, economic, cultural, and political factors influence changes in population? So let's kind of turn it on its head. We change something with the economy. We change a political dynamic in our political system. Our culture changes, or we have the mixing of cultures, the cultural synthetic change that's going on. How does that change our population? And then lastly, how do changes in population affect the place's economy, culture, and politics? So really what we're looking at, for the most part, is how is population impacted, and how is population impacting our society? So those are the ideas that we're trying to get around with, and how we're building throughout the unit, not only with population studies, but also with migration. So the way that Mr. Lynch sets up his PowerPoints may be a little bit different than mine for the sections that he does. So if you may like his better, you like mine better, but we're really getting after the same thing, which is breaking down what these standards say. So I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time going through these in terms of reading them for you. I'll kind of paraphrase them because what I've done is basically put in some material after these slides to give you the idea of how we can discuss that standard. So when we look at our first section, 2.1, we're looking at, first of all, identifying the factors that influence the distribution of human populations at different scales. So again, what impacts our distribution? What are the methods that geographers use to calculate population density? And then how do we explain the differences between and the impact of methods to use that calculation, use to calculate the population density? So in essence, like, how is the method that we use, what does it tell us about the population pressures on that land? So let's go ahead and take a look for 2.1. So when we talk about physical factors of what impacts how and where people live, it's a pretty easy conversation to understand, I believe. Those factors would include climate. So we know that people are more likely to live and cluster in areas where the climate is good. They are less likely to not do that, right? I mean, we look at the poles, for instance. We look even in desert regions. Climate is not sustainable for people to live there. So climate does make a difference. Different landforms can have an impact as well. So when we maybe look in the Himalayas, and we look at, say, even India as a country. India is an extraordinarily populated country, but it is not in the areas that are more mountainous in the northern part of the country. So again, landforms can alter where we live and settle. And bodies of water make a huge impact, because when we look at reasons why culture starts and we look at the cultural hearths, we cannot exclude bodies of water making a huge impact on where people cluster. So whether that be a river, a lake, an ocean, a bay, all of those will attract people because of the advantages that bodies of water brought, both for trade, lifestyle, industry, and jobs. All of those made a difference. And we can look at even like Louisiana as a state in the city of New Orleans. New Orleans is where it is because it's where the Mississippi River, which flows down from north to south, the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico, and New Orleans was based there. So again, these population centers in many points are located where these bodies of water interact or come to be. Savannah was the largest city in our state for quite a long time until Atlanta started to build. And Savannah was that way because, again, its location. So physical factors make that difference. Cultural factors also can make a difference in how people come to be living where they do and where population clusters happen. When we look at culture, economics, history, and politics, and just a few ideas here, New York is home to around 8.5 million people because of its predominance as an economic center. People don't move to New York for the weather. They don't move there because it's where the Hudson River, and they like to just, roll up and down the river. That's not what they're doing. They're there because jobs are there. So we have population clusters where the economics are strong. And because of the economics, culturally it is built up and it has a shared history, and it's also a political center. But the economics drew the population there. Washington, D.C. is literally built on a swamp. Yet because of its political standing, people flock to Washington, D.C., and you see a population center there. Then when you think about history, a town called Mecca, which is really unordinary in every way in Saudi Arabia, but because it's such a high localized importance for Muslims around the world, this is an area that people have flocked to and that have grown. So again, where and why is population where it is? We can look at physical factors, we can look at cultural factors. So then we measure population density. And when we do this, there's three different ways we can do it. Where we look at simply arithmetic, where we take the total number of people and divide it by total amount of land. So that's really, when we talk about density, that's what we mostly talk about. But when we look at physiological, now we're looking at density and looking at it on how many farmers that we have. So it's the total number of farmers divided by the total amount of land. So in a country like the United States, which has less farmers per capita than many LDCs, you're going to see a lower number here for physiological. The density is going to be less. Agricultural changes it a little bit because now instead of total land, we're considering arable land. How many farmers are there for how much arable land there is? If you're a country that has a lot of farmers and not much arable land, you're not going to be doing good, right? We look at a country called, it's not like Egyptism or something you don't know, but when we think about a country like Egypt, which has a limited amount of arable land because it's in a desert. If you're not around the Nile River, you're probably not going to see a lot of agricultural activity. So because it's arable land, it's less, it will have a higher agricultural density. So usually MDCs are going to have a lower agricultural density. And when we talk in the agriculture unit, we talk about why that is and how there's so fewer farmers. And in LDCs, you'll have a higher density for agricultural density. So all these are ways that we can calculate density. We look at a map here. This shows us population density, and not surprising. Areas of the world where we see high population density. South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and then also we can look at Western Europe. You're starting to see a little bit in sub-Saharan Africa in certain spots. And then, of course, we can look at maybe the East Coast as well. So these are areas that you have high amounts of population density, whereas you can see the lower amounts, and you could probably, very easily explain why there are lower amounts there. Lots of landforms here in this area. You've got climate concerns right here. You've got, again, climate. Nobody wants to live up there in Siberia. Australia, that's where all those evil, like dingoes and kangaroos and all those animals in Australia, you don't want to mess with those. You seen some of those spiders live down there? I'm not moving there. So again, lots of reasons why density is going to be higher and lower. If it's going to be high, you've got to have jobs there. The climate is favorable. Landforms available, and also body of water usually are the reasons why you see higher density. Physiological density, this gives you kind of an idea. Again, the total amount of people, or farmers rather, divided by total amount of land. And then really what we want to look at is agricultural density. And this is where you can see the higher dense areas are also many of them LDCs, whereas the NDCs have a low agricultural density. All right, 2.2, the consequences of that distribution of population. So how has that distribution and density affected society and the environment? And what are the implications of those consequences? That's what we're looking at here as we kind of build on the fact that, okay, now we know how it's distributed. Now let's look at how it moves around. So economic, political, and social processes. So if you're going to have more people, it would make sense that you would have more services and job opportunities. People are moving to Cobb County not because of the beautiful vistas and all the Publixes. They're moving here because of jobs, right? And services will build because those jobs are here. So you will get all the Publixes because of more people and more jobs, right? It's kind of a cyclical thing. You move more people here, the more jobs will be created. That will attract more people. It kind of is a never-ending cycle, right? When we get into political geography, if you have more people clustered, the district size for their congressional district will be smaller. So when we get into gerrymandering with Unit 4, we'll come back and talk about that. And then also the urban versus rural split, not just with the economy, but also culturally, politically, the differences between lifestyles of people that live in Atlanta and Metro Atlanta, and then with South Georgia, North Georgia, Southeast Georgia, wherever you want to go that's not Metro Atlanta, there is a huge cultural difference, and that is a consequence of the population distribution, right? So like there are experiences that you can have in both places that you will not have in the other because of the either clustered population or dispersed population. And this is some town in South Georgia, and it's very delightful, I think. It's quite lovely. So when we talk further about the environmental implications of that distribution, well, I mean, when you get a lot of people in one place, it's going to drain natural resources. That shouldn't surprise you. It also shouldn't surprise you that when you get into these urban areas, the population is going to be high and in many places difficult to control. So we have to look at the question of carrying capacity. Which definitionally is the population an area of the land can support without significant environmental deterioration. How much can the land hold? Most cities were built on areas with higher carrying capacity, meaning that arable soil, water source, climate, but there's got to be a point where the balance is challenged. So how much can the land support? We can argue for that here in Cobb County. At some point, we run out of land to build houses. And when we build new neighborhoods, then you have to build services around the neighborhood. So at some point, we've got to ask ourselves, how can we continue to expand our urban areas in a more sustainable way? Because the carrying capacity of these places can only hold so many for so long. And in many areas around the world, that question is already very much being asked, much more so than maybe we have to ask it here in Metro Atlanta. So when we look at the consequences of population distribution, we're going to look at population pyramids. That's really the big way that we analyze this distribution of population in a country, not so much where people live, but what makes up or composes that population. So we're going to look at age, sex ratio, and then as we look at these pyramids, how they can be interpreted in different ways. So a couple things that, I think I use that picture later on. I really hope I do, because it's a wonderful picture. I mean, you have Beverly here. She's, she's laughing because she's got a royal flush here. I mean, she's about to throw it down. Clark here is really just having a good time hanging with the ladies. And, Clarice, I mean, she's having fun too. So, in any case, what factors do we consider with population composition? We can look at ethnicity. When we look at where people are distributed, many members of a certain ethnicity will tend to group into cluster regions. That's certainly true in larger cities, where we will see areas like Chinatown and Little Italy and things like that. We also look at what is called the dependency ratio, which is, again, like how many, what percentage of your population has to be supported by others, that they're too old or too young. And if it's a high rate, then the government's got to figure out how to care for those people, because they're either too old to work or they're too young. And child labor is an inconvenient thing. Do not quote that out of context. So again, what do you do? And then the last factor we'll consider is sex ratio. It's the number of males per 100 females. A developed country will likely have more females. They live quite longer, and those developed countries have a higher life expectancy. But what are the implications for a country if they have a sex ratio that is highly imbalanced toward males? China, after the introduction of their one-child policy, saw that happen. So what are the consequences of that? So these are factors that must be considered. If we look at the dependency ratio, you can see in this graph really what is going to happen over time. And you look at the number of elderly persons per 100 working age persons, it's only going to increase as the world continues to age. Right now, if we look at it, certainly Japan is a leader there at 2020 in Western Europe. But 40 years later, you're going to see everybody kind of move up. And then by 2100, you're looking at much of the area in Southern Europe and Northern Africa joining into that, South America as well. You're going to have a lot of older people. So again, this is an issue that's going to have to be addressed, dependency ratio. When we look at the sex ratio, again, with a higher rate, you're going to get more males, and a lower rate, you're going to get more females. So just kind of interesting to look at that. And then we also can look at a different scale. So like when we looked at the previous slide, we look at like what is the sex ratio per country, but now we're looking at it per state. And you can see the male share of the population quite lower in the South and quite higher in the upper Midwest. So kind of interesting maybe to look at and think about the facts of why that might be. Okay, so here is a skill that there's a very good chance, relative to everything else, that you may have to impart, I don't know what the word is. You're gonna have to maybe read a population pyramid and know how to interpret it and to know what comes of that country because of that. So when we look at a population pyramid, we're looking at several things. When we look at the vertical axis, we're looking at age groups, right? Split into groups of 5 years. When we look at the horizontal axis, we start in the middle at 0%, and then as we go outward, we're looking at the amount of the population that is in that age bracket. So for example, if I get my handy dandy marker right here, let's go green, and I circle this bar right here, this bar represents the part of the population that's 0 to 4, ages 0 to 4, that are male. So in this country, Nigeria, what is that? 8.5% or something like that of their population were males under the age of 4. Okay, nearly 1 out of every 10 people in Nigeria were that age. That's quite a lot, right? Especially relative to some other numbers. So again, that's how we read that pyramid. So each of these, this is just a term, like each of those terms is called a cohort. I don't think you're going to need to know that, but that's how we refer to them. So when we look at the pyramid, we can find several things and figure out several things. We can see what stage they are in the DTM. We can see if they're an aging population. We can look at them relative to others and see maybe what their future holds. There's a lot of things that we can identify based on what the pyramid looks like. So we got several pyramids here. These are more like what ifs, and because we're gonna go through when we look at the DTM like what a population pyramid looks like for each of those countries. Here's what we look at the USA, right, with this aging population, but then the cutoff or slowing birth rate, if you will, down below. But looking at several of these, what we can do is look at a pyramid and say, okay, here's like what's going to be happening. Here's why it's happening that way, and here's the consequences of that. So the first thing is with Lawrence, Kansas, we see a high rate of male and females that are 20 to 24. Well, that's an easy explanation. Lawrence, Kansas is where Kansas University is. So it's a high levels of teens and 20s. It's a college town. And because of that, you're probably going to have a high rate of bars and, quote, drinking establishments because there's such a large amount of people that are looking for that service. So what is in your area, town, city, even state, services will be catered toward the dominant populations, right? Because it's about making the money. So when we go to Naples, Florida, we have an aging population. That's pretty easy. And that's the case. Naples, a lot of old people, it's a retirement center. So you're going to have services tailored to an older population. You're going to have a lot of bingo halls. I mean, they love playing bingo, right? You're going to have a lot of nursing homes. You're going to have a lot of Cracker Barrels. I mean, old people love Cracker Barrel. I love Cracker Barrel. I mean, who doesn't, right? Maybe young people. I don't know if you do or not, but whatever. So again, Naples has that in it. Laredo, Texas. It is proportionally younger than the rest of the country. You're not going to see this population pyramid much in the U.S. because this is evidence that migrants from Mexico have come into Laredo, which is a border town, and we know that most often migrants are going to be in the younger ages, not so much up here, but they're going to be more down in here, right? Single adults, and then they may bring their kids with them. So again, the population pyramid could tell the story of whatever is going on in that area. So you can look then at this not just in a city but also a country, right? Denmark's going to have an aging population, so they're going to have fewer child care options. They're going to have less funding for education proportionally to other countries because it's an aging country. So they're going to have to figure out as a government to spend on what the majority of the population needs. So I don't have an example to show you here, but like you can actually see, like if you pull up Germany's or Russia or any of those countries that fought in World War II, the United Kingdom, maybe France, you can actually see evidence of a war on the pyramid because in those ages, if you do the math for when those people would have been fighting, like 18 to 25 and so many years ago, you're going to see that men are going to be a shorter share of the population than women. And that's not because their parents had more women. It's because a war happened. And you're also going to see less children born during the conflict. So you can see what they call an echo, and you can see like that term down here. You'll be able to see the echo about 20 years later. There may be less in that cohort. So you're going to see after the war, you see this with the U.S., a baby boom, right? Soldiers come home and they see their wives, and I don't know how it works, but 9 months later, babies come. So, but then you're also going to have, like, after the baby boom, you're going to have what's called a baby bust, where you'll see the birth rate go down, and the cohorts will literally, like, shrink more toward the center. And again, take a look at the United States, Germany, one of those countries that fought in World War II, you'll see that pattern. And then you'll see what's called an echo. So like 20 years later, the baby boom generation, they will have children. And it's not that the birth rate is going up, but what they're doing is basically replenishing the population. Cool video here. I'm not going to show it, but check out Ted Ed's video on the population pyramid. It's a good way to kind of sum up everything. I would recommend it. So check that out. Okay. So, population dynamics. So much of this unit is knowing how to talk about population. And knowing how to use the terms to be able to reference your discussion. So if there is a question on population on the AP test, which I would not be shocked if there were, then you need to be able to have command of these terms to be able to discuss what the trends are. Things like crude birth rate, crude death rate, natural increase rate. These terms you got to be able to use effectively and in context to be able to explain the concepts. Otherwise, you're not going to get credit for just, beating around the bush, right? And not being able to talk specifically about these issues. So when we look at those primary terms, this is the bread and butter, right? This is where you need to be able to master these terms to be able to use them effectively in discussion. Crude birth rate, number of births per 1,000 people in your country. We look at that per year. Crude death rate, the number of deaths per 1,000 people, and then what we call the natural increase rate, which is the percentage at which a country's population is growing or declining without the impact of migration. That's why we call it natural, right? What's happening in that country. So if the birth rate is higher than the death rate, you're going to have a positive increase rate. If it's significantly higher, your increase rate is going to be very high. Let's say your birth rate is extremely low, but a lot of people dying, then your country is shrinking, right? And the only way then to increase your population is to, in essence, bring people in and really focus on immigration. We also use the term doubling time, which refers to the amount of time it takes for the population to double. If your natural increase rate is higher, then doubling time will be shorter, right? Makes sense. So when we look at a map here, I love maps, they're good, right? Geography, maps, important. How we look at natural increase rate, we can look at countries around the world where increase rate is high. And Africa is doing strong here, right? 2.0 and above. South America, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia. In essence, the LDCs will have a higher natural increase rate. Now, you'll notice Eastern Europe, Western Europe, North America has a lower increase rate. Why is that? We'll get into that in a second. During the 21st century, the natural increase rate has been around 1.2. The natural increase rate is, as you can see, greater than 2 in sub-Saharan Africa. It's around 0.6 in the United States, and in parts of Europe, it is less than 0, meaning the natural increase rate in Europe is actually not an increase rate at all. It's a decreasing figure. So again, knowing where it's happening is important. Knowing why it's happening, we'll get into as we discuss. So some other important terms that we'll use in our discussion: total fertility rate. So this is a number of births. This is not a you're adding or subtracting. It's the average rate of births to women 15 to 49 years old. For the world, women on average have 2.6 children. It's as high as 6 in some areas. When you look at the United States, that number 2.6, it is lower. Your grandparents, great-grandparents generation, that number would be higher, but it is lower today. Why is that? We'll talk as we go. Infant mortality rate. That is the number of deaths of 1-year-olds per 1,000 births. It will be higher in the LDCs. It will be lower in MDCs. Why is it lower? Well, it comes with the territory of an MDC. More hospitals, higher quality health care, more diffusion of medicines, and also cultural changes as well, but certainly the economic development of an area helps certainly to lower that infant mortality rate. And then we also look at life expectancy, the number of years an infant can live on average in the United States. That number actually increased after decreasing marginally into, I think, 78 or so, higher for women. And in some countries, it can go up to 83 or 84. The lowest, I think, is around 55, but don't quote me on that. This is a blank screen, which is now shooting a map of the total fertility rate of the world at you. Again, not too surprising, where we look at sub-Saharan Africa as a much higher rate. We talk about why is that the case? Well, I mean, anything from a higher infant mortality rate, knowing that many children will die because of the lack of good health care. That's something else you can look at, because women are going to have more children to be able to have enough. You can look at agricultural primary sector jobs, which needs more hands around the house. You can also look at cultural impact. For example, in Afghanistan, which is culturally fundamentalist Islam ruled by the Taliban, which is an extraordinarily conservative reactionary government, very fundamentalist. You're going to see women not in many roles of career or professional ability. They're going to be more viewed as the traditional mother. And that's something that they're going to be basically stuck, not stuck in essence, but there's no flexibility, right, in terms of what their role can be. So sub-Saharan Africa is leading the way there. And you see, obviously, in other areas in MDCs in the Northern Hemisphere, that number is lower. South America kind of was somewhere in the middle, which is pretty much true of South America and kind of the spectrum of many things. It's not going to be where the Northern Hemisphere countries, Australia, South Korea, Japan, but it's not going to be certainly as in the ballpark of where sub-Saharan Africa and some areas of Southwest Asia, the Middle East are. More of the same. Fertility rate for adolescents. So what are we measuring here? Yeah, I think I'll just skip that one. Infant mortality rate. So again, lack of health care, lack of easy access to hospitals, poor diet, medicine not diffused throughout society. I mean, all of these are leading to higher rates here in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, 2014, when Ebola was spreading throughout Western Africa, so much of it was the lack of, not that people were more susceptible to the disease, but their living arrangements put them in a position to where it was easier to transfer the Ebola virus. We look at life expectancy. Here you can see areas of the country where life expectancy is lower. Certainly in the South, we're crushing it, right? Now, life expectancy lower in the South for a variety of reasons. Part of that is just more areas of poverty in the South. It's more rural. There's less amount of jobs. So you're going to see lower areas of life expectancy because of that. Where in these areas are more rural, you have less access to medical services, and the Appalachian region, the Mississippi Delta, even parts of Oklahoma, South Dakota, which you see some Indian reservations in these areas, which have a lack of services. Whereas areas on the West Coast and the East Coast, Florida, Denver, Upper Midwest, you may have more access to those services. And you can also know, you see these little specks of blue in areas where there's red, like this is Nashville, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston. Let's see, obviously Atlanta right here, DC. So those urban areas, Denver, you're going to see a higher rate to be able to get those services. So really, I talked about all this stuff, like what can impact all these figures, your access to healthcare and technology, the changes in the type of work might impact the amount of kids you need. So if you're getting more service-based jobs, you don't need those hands, right, that you may need agricultural areas. The rise of women's professional opportunities that might delay childbirth. So if women have that choice to go to college, they're going to delay that decision. Birth control being diffused. That's a huge thing that I didn't discuss, is that in these countries, that once you get birth control diffused throughout the society, you're going to see that fertility rate go down. You're going to see that natural increase rate go down. You're going to see that birth rate, CBR, go down. Religious values that shift, that might be an issue. Certainly Catholicism views toward birth control is an example of that. I mentioned Afghanistan and the Taliban and their kind of fundamentalist values. Government programs to encourage or discourage childbirth. So we look at China, the one-child policy. We look at programs like Do It for Denmark, and Denmark are really trying to push a higher natural increase rate. So there's a lot of things that you can bring in and discuss of why these figures change. And it's a fascinating discussion to get into that. Okay, so there is some thought that this is the big one. That if you understand the DTM and are able to bring in other concepts in the class, that you are really getting it. And the DTM really shapes a lot of the things that we look at. And not only that, but we can also look at the epidemiological transition model, which we will after we kind of go through the DTM here. Okay, cool video you might want to check out. 7 billion, how did we get here so fast? That's an intro video I like to show. This is also good. This video here can allow you to kind of see population clusters and when time and events that make the change and that increase the amount of population. All right, so what is the DTM? It's been, when my picture disappeared. That's kind of sad, but whatever. The DTM is a visual way for us to show death rate, birth rate, natural increase rate, and a way to show the effects of how those things change. And we can classify countries based on their population dynamics based on this model. There are technically 4 stages to the model, but there's really 5, so there's 5. And there's never been a country that demographers have downgraded on the model. You can only go up, right? So once you get to 5, you're kind of there. So I don't know how that would work to kind of go backwards, but demographers or population scientists basically say you can't go backward. Hey, there's my map. How about that? Or my map, my picture. So we'll look at this again after we get done with our DTM discussion, but you're looking again at birth rate, death rate, the natural increase, why that change happens, the reasons for changes in the death rate, and each of these stages you can classify based on those questions. And then you can see as total population goes up, death rate and birth rate are always dropping. That's one key to this. At no point does death rate and birth rate go up. The one possibility is, and we're talking like long term, we're not talking like 6 months or something. The one possibility of one of these figures going up is death rate in stage 5. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay, stage 1. Low growth. Your population is not growing in stage 1. And most of human history was at stage 1. But nobody is here now. We're all out of stage 1. But for most of history, we were here. You had a high crude birth rate and a high crude death rate. Babies being born all over the place, right? And you need them to pick all the berries and to hunt all the saber-toothed tigers. But guess what? People dying all over the place too. You roll through aunts and uncles just like that. I mean, it was tough. Hunter-gatherer societies, but we also can say, like, you start to see agricultural societies at stage 1. When agriculture is developed, people start to live longer. But it's still unpredictable because of war, disease, and guess what? Hey, if the sun don't come out one year, you're dead, right? I mean, all the plants die and you're done. So stage 1, high crude birth rate, high crude death rate, and that means if both are high, your population is not growing, right? If we do the math, right, if it's 8 and 8, that's 0, right? There's no growth to natural increase rate. And like I said, no country is still in stage 1. Now we look at stage 2. Now, when stage 2 comes around, you still have a lot of babies being born. However, your death rate is going down, and that creates a high natural increase rate, which means your population is, it's going up. I tried to whistle there. It kind of worked, I guess. So why does this occur? Well, we look at through history, and we can look at some events that trigger that growth. The Industrial Revolution led to an increase in technology, which helped create wealth, and with better wealth comes better health. Okay, with more health or more wealth comes more health. Wealth to health. If you make more money, you can afford to live in a better place, and that living condition change can help you live longer. It also allowed for the production of more supplies to be able to help you live. I mean, you get more shirts out there that are made, textile factories have more shelter or have more clothing to help protect you from the elements, and that's a good thing. But another big thing is the mechanization of agriculture, which happens during the Industrial Revolution. When you have more consistent yields or output for agriculture, it leads to more consistent diet, which leads to a longer lifespan, and the death rates fall. So here's the key. Population goes up. When I hear that, I always think, oh, there's more babies. That is not the case. When population goes up in stage 2, it is because more people live longer. The life expectancy goes up. Case in point, in the developing world, in LDCs, after World War II, you see what we call the medical revolution. Improved medical practices in these areas begin to reduce deaths. It increases the living age. Nobody had more babies. There was no reason for that. The reason was that things happened to help people live longer. Now, you're still going to get people having a lot of babies because they don't know that they're living longer as they're living, right? So when we get into stage 3, we're going to talk about what that implication is. So we look at a stage 2 country. Birth rate remains high, all right, but death rate is dropping, so people live longer. So if we look at the kind of the pyramid here, you're still going to have a high amount of population in these younger ages, but you're starting to see these upper areas go a lot more to the exterior, right? They're kind of moving out to this side a little better. My arrows are so great, right? That's embarrassing. I'm going to have to erase those. Okay, goodbye, arrows. So again, stage 2 country, the pyramid will always have a wider base like that. Okay, stage 3, moderate growth. The crude birth rate declines, the crude death rate declines, and the natural increase rate begins to drop. Okay, so here's what's starting to happen. All the changes to CDR with the death rate, those are continuing. But for birth rate, people are starting to figure out, you know what? I don't have to have 10 kids to live in this house that I have in the city because I know they're starting to live longer. Medical advances are happening. I can feed my kid more consistently. Those things are good. I don't have to have 10 kids. I just have 3, right? So people start to realize I don't have to have as many children. So the birth rate decreases, and these several things here, right? Sanitation improvements, so mortality rate is going down, more children surviving, meaning less babies are being born. Then you have a rural to urban shift due to jobs, right? So like people are moving to cities, and when they move to cities, all these services started popping up. So like, for example, you know, my daughter is going to do this dance camp in the summer, and it's based on Disney princesses, and it's going to be nuts. I already am going crazy thinking of how wild that's going to be. That service doesn't exist unless there's a market for it. So when you have more children there, people are like, let me hold a dance camp. Like these parents are going to pay me money to do that. It's going to happen. So children, the shift is happening from children being hands to work for now that they're becoming an economic burden. Question is, I'm not going to have more kids to help me make more money. Can I afford to have more kids? That becomes the question as stage 3 develops. So you see this start to change over stage 3. And because of all these things, birth rate's going down, death rate continues to decline. They're not as quickly as birth rate now, and natural increase rate begins to drop. In stage 2, death rate was much lower than birth rate, and now they're starting to get a little tighter, which means that natural increase rate number is dropping. So it's reflected in the pyramid. See, right? The birth rate is shrinking, right? There's less kids here. So you know in a pyramid, you're getting into stage 3 when you start to see that birth rate go more into the interior. Okay, so let me kind of put the marker on it again. So when you see the change right here, okay, When that birth rate starts to go more toward the middle, that's when you know the country is shifting into a stage 3 scenario in which the natural increase rate is now dropping. So then we get to stage 4, and now we're looking at low growth. Okay, now we have a very low birth and death rates with no long-term growth. We have caught up to where we were in stage 1, where the birth rate and death rate are basically the same. Now, 2000, like Western Europe's there, the U.S. is close. We're basically there now in stage 4. So what's the change, and what continues to precipitate this change in low birth rate? The major changes, we're seeing women's rights change. Women are becoming more educated. They're working longer, meaning they're going into more years of education and making the choice at 22, 23, do I want to have kids now, or do I want to work on my career? That is a question that women for much of human history have not been able to answer. The choice was easy. You make babies. But now that choice is existing for women, and both choices are beautiful choices, and there is no inherent like worth to one over the other. The fact is the choice exists, and many women choose career, which leads to less children. My sister's that way. She's 30 years old. She works in Washington, D.C., not married, doesn't plan to have kids, works on her career. That's kind of what she's doing. So that is a choice. And let's say women get into the career and then decide to have kids. Well, listen, you know the clock is ticking, right? Eventually that clock's going to run out, and you can't have kids anymore. You can't have children. So you have less of a window to have babies, and that leads to less children. Fertility rate goes down, birth rate is going down, and you see that happening. There's a couple other things you could say. We got all our Netflix. We don't need to have babies. Pollution and political pessimism. The world's going to fall apart. Whatever. But women's rights. This is the big one. Okay. When that change happens, that is when you see that birth rate drop. And then if we see it then in the chart, you've got that drop continuing, right? Birth rate continues to drop and go more toward the center. There's, we know death rate and birth rate are about even, and there's very little growth. And then finally, we have a stage 5 country, and really what we can say here is that the birth rate is now actually lower than the death rate. The NIR actually becomes negative, and the death rate can go up a little higher because of aging population. Right? You have so many old people that the death rate is actually higher than it was maybe in stage 4. And the only way your population can grow, now the only part of your country, or at this point that you can get bigger, is with immigration. And here we go, stage 5. It's just kind of continued into that birth rate is going in, and eventually going to get smaller and smaller. So you want to increase your population, you got to go out and get people. And here we go. It's basically the chart again, what we've gone through. You can kind of look at that and have questions. You see again, birth rate finally with group stage 3 begins to drop, and it catches it at the kind of the confluence of stage 4 and 5. Now on the side of that, we have what's called the epidemiological transition model, which is kind of a parallel with the DTM of looking at what the death rates look like for each stage. I'm going to go through that just real fast. So with ETM, when we look at stage 1, we're looking at, just crap, right? I mean, plagues, famine, pestilence, and you don't have medicine, so death rate's going to be very high. Stage 2, then, you're going to have, you're going to still have pandemics, you're going to still have plague a little bit better now. You have things like cholera, which John Snow helped solve. That's the pictures of John Snow. He helps figure out what was going on with cholera in 1851 in London. But death rate is going to go down because we do have some things like medication, agriculture that are improving the situation, but you're still going to have that thing. Let's just say stage 2, you're going to have less random stuff kill you. It's going to be more of these like larger things that medicine has not solved yet. Stage 3, then, as people begin to live longer and you get better health care, better medical care, now we're going to see like basically old people disease, right? I mean, that comes with it. Degenerative diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancer, these things that are tragic, but it's more of like, hey, you're getting old, right? I mean, these things happen. Stage 4, obesity becomes an issue with lifestyle changes. But then stage 5 is interesting. And I don't know, there might be there just could possibly be a current event example that you could connect here. There's the thought in stage 5, you're going to have the continuing thing with degenerative diseases with an aging population. But there's something else. As people in stage 5 countries become more and more economically developed, they open themselves up to be able to migrate around the world much easier. Technological improvements allow you to go from place to place a lot faster, a lot easier. Sometimes governments are working more together to encourage immigration. Let's say like the European Union with open borders. But with that, if you say, I don't know, if you get a virus, and let's say that virus is easily contagious, there is a thought is that as you kind of have a world which is much more interconnected, that virus could spread, and maybe we have pandemics. I mean, you could figure it out, but that's basically what we got, right? So again, the ETM, kind of going back to the beginning, is like there's a return to stage 1 and 2 with these pandemics, not because we lack the medicine to handle it, but because of how interconnected we are, and that it's so easy to have an outbreak, a global outbreak, than it was before when people were limited by transportation. Okay, 2.6 Malthusian theory. I'm going to go through this real quick, kind of the essence of Malthus and what he was all about. So we talk about rising population. Thomas Malthus had a major thesis which said that population growth would outpace the production of food. That is, and he was writing in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Malthus believed that we were growing population so quickly in stage 2 at that point in Western Europe that eventually the amount of food would run out. And when we get to that point of crisis, that basically means there's not enough food for the amount of people there are. And that's not too good, right? That's going to be bad news for all of us. And throughout history, you continue to have people that believe that. The neo-Malthists believe that once the developing world, LDCs, entered stage 2, that's going to lead to global famine, because we just cannot keep up with food production with the amount of people that are out there. And that's not just food. That could be other resources as well, whatever those might be. So the core of this idea is that, again, population explosion is going to overtake the amount of resources we can produce to be able to handle that growth in population. Well, yeah, kind of, Thomas. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he and the neo-Malthists are not right. And a few things we can look at. The Boserup theory suggests that science and technology will increase the ability to grow more food, which is absolutely true. And we can see that in the Green Revolution, which was able to feed the world, fed billions with GMOs, more drought-resistant wheat. That's something that Malthus did not expect, is to be able to have scientific ways to be able to exponentially increase food production. He also didn't anticipate declining birth rates, and that eventually in a country that as you enter stage 3 and stage 4, that birth rates will go down, and that puts less pressure on a society and government to be able to feed everybody. So a combination of those factors so far is how Thomas Malthus has been wrong. And I always connect this to Thanos, right? Thanos with I hope you heard that over the microphone. I mean, he's looking to, because there's so many people and there's so few resources, let's just like genocide everybody, right? Just like that, have the people. Not great, and probably wrong if human history is any indication. So why is all this relevant? Who cares? Well, the last three sections, which are fairly short, we're going to go through them fairly quickly. It matters because we have to make decisions based on these real changes. And not only governments, but also when we look at women and aging populations. Lives change and have great impact on the way we work as a society, and rights change as well because of that. So when we look at population policies, we're looking at two terms mostly. We're looking at pronatalist and antinatalist policies that are either promoting or discouraging population growth, and there are a ton of examples that you can use to explain this. When we look at pronatalist policies, we're looking at programs that are designed by governments to increase the fertility rate. So this is probably only happening in countries that are, say, stage 4, stage 5. Maybe in human history you see like you see some other historical examples, but that usually ties in with a political connection. We'll talk about it in a second. So what programs can we talk about? Well, how about paid time off for jobs held by mothers? So mamas, you can have time off from your jobs. The government's going to take care of you or provide free childcare. All these economic burdens that children can create, and trust me, they create a lot. The government steps in to try to create a program to help ease those burdens, to convince you, hey, it's okay to have more kids. We got your back. Family discounts are government services. There's a link there that shows what Hungary is doing. The Do It for Denmark campaign I've already mentioned, where a travel company in Denmark basically created a PR campaign to say, hey, come on one of these vacations so you can do it, whatever that means, and that we can have more kids because we are not having enough children in Denmark. The fear being, if you just let your birth rate go to pot, then your culture could die, right? And that's, for a lot of people, a very motivating factor to preserve their culture. You got to have more babies. In history, you can also see examples. Hitler employed, Mussolini employed pronatalist policies. Often in fascist countries, you see that where the role of women is restricted to more of a motherly, mom role, basically a baby maker, for lack of a better term. That is something that's present in many fascist countries where it's not about you or the individual, it's about the state, right? You gotta have more children. That's your role. Do it now. More ways than one. So, whatever. We look at antinatalist policies now. We're growing. We got to get smaller. And probably the best example of that is the one-child policy, which I've mentioned a couple times. India, also in the mid-20th century, have forced sterilizations of women. So you're going to see this in stage 2, maybe stage 3 countries. China now currently has a 2-child policy, which has had other effects, but certainly the one-child policy, the reduction in adult workers to support an aging population, where they did successfully stem the tide of population growth. However, that had other impacts. And by the way, the one-child policy was mostly just for Chinese living in urban areas and of a particular ethnicity. It did not really impact people living in rural areas because, you have space, right? And in rural area, agricultural job, you need more hands. If you're working in the cities, you stop having babies. So again, that was kind of the idea behind it. One other thing with population policies is also immigration. We'll see that when we talk about the migration section. So we've talked a lot about women already and how women have been instigators of demographic change. Certainly when we talk about population, we're not cloning people yet, right? Not really doing that. So really the only way to increase population, if we're talking about birth rate, is to have more children. And last time I checked, I can't do that. And okay, so what has the changing role of females, what consequences has that had on values across the world? And so listen, this is a gold slide right here. The fact is the changing roles of women around the world are influencing demographic factors all around the world, mostly in stage 4 and 5 countries. So you can see all that evidence there. A couple things I want to hit that we haven't really done in Western countries. So North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, politically and social rights, there has been a lot more influence and emphasis on women's roles the last 50 years, politically, starting with the vote with suffrage about 100 years ago, and that has only increased. So certainly we as a society in America 2020 place a high emphasis on gender equality, um, and that's something that has led to, like I talked about, giving women more of a social. It's more socially acceptable to choose to not have children. Um, and because of that, if they do delay that decision, then you have less kids because, again, the biological clock still runs out. Now, also, and I've harped on this a little bit, but the diffusion of reliable birth control methods will lower the fertility rate. So even if you are like, if your goal is to be in that motherly role, you might just want to have one kid. And that might be your story, and that may be what you want to do. So you just stick with that and that plan. That's where you go, and that's what you do. And the diffusion of birth control methods gives you that opportunity to make that choice. So basically, as you go up the stages, women are more empowered to make decisions because of the social changes, the political changes, the economic changes, and also the technological changes, which give them the ability to make those decisions. And I think, if anything, this proves the point, right? This shows you the percent of 25 to 32-year-olds with at least a 4-year college degree. 40, 50 years ago, you see that it's gone up for everybody, but you see +8 to men in 1970, and now we're in 2013. That's when this chart was made. It's going to be a similar number today. Women +7. So whereas men have gone up 11%, women have gone up over 3 times as much. So again, the choice is there for women, and because of that, a consequence is that you're going to have less kids, birth rate goes down, fertility rate goes down, and you have these cultural changes. Last thing to look at, aging population. So explain the causes and consequences of an aging population. In my classes, we hit that video on Japan, and we looked at a Japanese rural area, what the consequences were, where there's so many older people there and all the younger people are moving and migrating, and then there's no young people to have babies in those areas. So if you can think back on that Japan video, I might try to link that somewhere for you to check out. Again, if you want to. Hey, look, our friends. I think Beverly, Clark, and Claris. And look, I mean, we love Richard, and he's over here on the right side. So again, the fact is, an aging population carries significant political, social, and economic consequences. The governments may have to design programs to accommodate and help the elderly. Guess who's paying for that? Taxpayers. So that's you, me. We're paying for those programs. Shortage of labor in the country. And that could lead to higher taxes to fund those programs. So there's not enough people to work. If there's less workers, you're going to have to increase the taxes to be able to cover all those programs. There could be a conflict socially due to generational disagreements. If your country or area is more older people, they might be less willing to engage in certain cultural activities or cultural change because of hey, they're just where they're at, right? No fault to them. The decline of services for the youth, and the increased need for immigration. That can lead to cultural conflict. So all of those things can play a role. All right, so we're done. So again, if you listen to the whole thing straight up, boy, great job. I hope this helped. Again, we're going to hit you with 2.10 to 2.12, which is migration, which will be much shorter than population. But again, it'll give you the big idea going forward. So be good, stay classy. We'll see you around.